social entrepreneurship, and also professor of organizations and impact at Saïd Business School here at Oxford. And I'm a visiting fellow of Kellogg College, and I'm thrilled to be here today at Kellogg hosting the Skoll Centre Insights for Action seminar. This seminar series, Insights for Action, explores how researchers and practitioners within and beyond Oxford are using research insights for action. Today, we're going to talk about impact monetization. And if you don't know what that is, don't worry, we're going to talk about that very soon. And talk about impact monetization in the context of impact measurement. I want to introduce our two speakers for the seminar today. Karim Harji is a Skoll Centre Fellow. He's the Program Director of the Oxford Impact Measurement Program. He just finished running the program for this week, and I know many of you who are in the program are here with us in the room, so welcome to all of you. He also teaches on the impact investing and social finance programs that we run, as well as the finance innovation program. Karim has published on industry trends and innovation in impact investing and impact measurement. He's done a lot of work to support the development of value-based impact measurement approaches and to work on the integrity of impact measurement. And he's designed impact education and training programs across many parts of the world. So welcome, Karim. And Sam Vionnet is also with us. Sam is the founder of Valuing Impact, a boutique consulting firm that supports organizations as they work to measure and value natural, social, and human capital across their value chains. And he works with, through Valuing Impact, multinational companies, impact funds, family offices, and a variety of other kinds of organizations. Also working to invest in the development of data and methods for improving impact measurement. Sam is the author of a book, Impact Thinking. We will talk about what impact thinking is and the insights from the book. And there are copies of the book on the table over there for you to take home after the session. So welcome again to both of you.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to start by talking about terms. So your book is Impact Thinking. We've titled the seminar Impact Monetization. What do you mean by impact and impact thinking? And then we'll get into impact monetization.
Yeah, I'm curious about the opinion of Karim about impact, but how I would frame impact is basically the value to society, value to nature, that we can create, the additional value to society that we can create. The impact thinking is a skill that allows, the critical thinking skill that allows to make better decisions to create more societal value or more impacts. That's very put simply. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, well, join the program. We spent a whole week on this. I would say that impact in general refers to the long-term changes at different levels, for people, planet, social issues, environmental issues, that we want to track the changes over time as a result of the kinds of things that we're investing in or are doing. And some of those changes could be positive, sometimes they're negative. We want to track impact in all of its forms, generally the temporal dimension. We have the language of financial accounting to describe the things in terms of financial value that we're creating, but we know we value others around our communities, around our planet, etc. So in some ways, the way we define impact here is all the non-financial. How do we have that language be able to describe what change looks like over various periods of time, but typically impact refers to the long-term time horizon. And what long-term would mean and what change looks like, again, is quite subjective. And so this is partly where there's not universal agreement, but there are starting points around the definitions of impact. And I would say for impact thinking, as we've really tried to develop this week in the program, is a set of skills to be able to work through some of these questions around what would impact look like differently in different organizations and stakeholders. Does your lived experience change the way you might determine what impact is and how you might measure it? There's those kinds of things to be able to bring a skill set to the way we think about impact questions. And finally, around monetization, it's really simply the idea of putting some kind of monetary value on these questions around what do we value in social and environmental issues. And the idea is that you can bring the language of finance to the language of impact that we talked about.
But you can also make things very much comparable, something that are as diverse as climate change, biodiversity, eutrophication, gender violence. You can all bring the same, you speak the same language, the same unit to measure those different impacts, positive and negative. So it's a way to make sense of the complexity of the world that compares things, so you can prioritize things, you can bring that to decision making and study. And that's really the tool it's not only the language for me, finance, it's also that, but it's also the capacity to prioritize things. Otherwise, we stay in silo and we don't see the big picture. So really to elevate the discussion when, I mean, I come from a poor background. I didn't have access to the big international before, but working on impact valuation opened the doors. You start talking the language of business, you then start talking to an elevated audience that take decisions that are the founders, like the financier of the world. So that brings a lot of very, very important insight that open the doors of the business world.
So maybe, let me ask you to give us an example of this, like in a project you've worked on, maybe with a large firm, it could be another kind of organization where you help them to start to do impact thinking and to use impact monetization tools.
Yeah.
Like, what does that look like on the ground?
I mean, it's about, it can be business or funds. It's about measuring everything, all the value chain of a company across all the impact drivers, human, social, and natural capital, bringing that overview of the value created by a company or by an investment portfolio and understanding the priorities and connecting that to the strategy to make sure that in the business strategy that you have, you want to make sure that, I don't know, if the supply chain, you have palm oil production with a lot of deforestation, it will show up in the valuation as high. You need to match that to an action, commitments in your strategy to address this high value. So that's the first use. Like it's about it's about understanding what matters, so you can connect that to the strategy, the business strategy. That's the first use. So that's the kind of company like Natura. Natura is a cosmetic company in Brazil. They own also Avon. They used to own the Body Shop and Aesop. They had to sell it last year, but it's a detail. And that's a company that took the tool as a way to connect that, because the complexity of ESG impact, sustainability in companies is huge. You have so many reporting systems. You have so many metrics and methods and initiatives that it starts to be very complex for a company to advance and prioritize and get a sense of focus. So impact valuation elevates all those topics together and reprioritize what is important. And Natura did it with us. There is a public version of the impact valuation results of the company, which is called integrated P&L. So as you were saying, we bring that information next to the financial reporting. And so you can see where you create value, or like where you have cost and profit and loss. In the financial, next to it, you can see where you have profit and loss in the society. So you start understanding where are the trade-off, where you can invest more to create financial value next to societal value. So that's a public report that is on the investor relation of the company. Another example might be Suma Equity. It's a PE fund, so private equity funds that have 5 or 6 billion investments. They have a portfolio of 18 companies. And they use that for both due diligence to make sure that they understand the risk of investing in a company and the opportunities to invest in a company, but also to engage actively the companies on what is material. So last week I was in Oslo with them, and we were discussing with the portfolio companies, and we were making sure that their strategy embed the valuation results so they can focus on what is material and then of course risk and opportunities. So that's a kind of example of companies that are using it. It's a young field. I'll stop with that. You can also compliment me, but it's a young field. So it's been, the first time it's been used was in 2010 by Puma, a brand, and then Kering, and then other companies followed suit, like Nestle, Danone, BASF, LafargeHolcim. Like the movement started to grow. Now we have protocols, we have methods that exist. There's still a long way before it's same maturity as the financial reporting, because objectively we want to have the same capacity, as Karim was saying, to have the reporting on impact and on financial next to each other with the same granularity. But there is still a long way to get there, but we well on our way, and like more and more companies worldwide are using this language.
Maybe I'll just jump in for a minute. Okay, great. I wanted to frame this. This is really helpful. So in some of the past seminars, we've talked about this idea of creating guardrails around social impact. And I think some of what you've described is very much the idea of creating a guardrail, right? In the form of reports that you can compare across different forms of social impact. You can compare social and financial And the way you describe the way you work with companies, you're helping them to create this kind of guardrail through a monetization approach to impact measurement that allows for attention to representation of the social and natural impact of the organization or of their investments alongside the financial impact. And so I think from a sort of a more macro perspective, there's a really important role that impact thinking and then monetization as a way of doing impact thinking is playing, which I think is very exciting, right? To see that developing with firms. Now you're working with a lot of different kinds of organizations, but I want to ask you in particular, because you're doing a lot of work on impact investing and also looking at impact measurement across different sectors. First, let's just start with, as you think about different approaches to measurement, what's the role of monetization? Because there are other ways of doing measurement.
Yeah. And I think this, again, there's no one way to do it typically for organizations, and even within monetization, there's a lot of different approaches. And so I would say if we zoom out a little bit and ask, why is this attractive? I think Sam covered it really well, that we know the language of numbers and finance and feels like that has some legitimacy and credibility. So one approach is to see, can we do this for social impact, environmental impact, to have the same kind of legitimacy and credibility because we think this work matters. And if you can't tell the true and representative story of the impact that you're trying to create, at the same time as lots of companies are making these claims that they are good for the world, there's also a lot of skepticism right now around how do you back that up? Do you back it up with a set of stories? Do you back it up with a randomized control trial? Do you do something quite rigorous around how you think about measurement? One approach that I think is attractive is to say, let's use what we know. Let's use numbers. Let's use something a bit more comparable and integrated to show and demonstrate the level of commitment and integrity. Now that raises lots of questions around who's doing it, how do you be, what does transparency mean? What does good enough look like, especially as Sam was saying, it's such a new field. Maybe I'll also just compare this because a lot of Sam's work in particular, and where some of this is being popularized is in the corporate space, where the claims to impact are somewhat different than in impact investing or social enterprise, etc., where some adjacent concepts have come from. In the corporate world, certainly I always have a healthy skepticism when I see claims to impact, and I would love to see more transparency. And so I think monetization can help us get there. About 15-ish years ago is when I first came across some of these concepts around social return on investment in particular. And back then it was applied to the concept of venture philanthropy. So the idea that you can get better results from philanthropy by bringing the concepts from a private sector or venture perspective to how you do your work. And so one of those kind of mindsets or approaches or tools was the idea that you could assign a social return on investment the same way as we look at financial or economic return on investment. Popularized initially through a group called RedF, and I work for a firm called Social Capital Partners that brought that to Canada. So that was very interesting because it's applied in a certain context of early stage social enterprise to try and think about a certain kind of value creation. Fast forward maybe 7 or 8 years, and you see monetization come out within the concept of social impact bonds. This is another innovation at this hybrid space around how governments can be contracting for outcomes, not just paying for activities. And there, the idea of assigning monetary values to say, what does the status quo look like? Do we get any value? And how do we think about outcomes? And this idea of monetizing, and including that into contracts was seen to be attractive. And in the last few years, you've seen almost a bit of a hybrid and intersection with impact investing, social impact bonds, venture philanthropy. And so I think we find ourselves in a very interesting place where the term is being used across these different spaces, but actually has a different history in how it's been applied. And I would say finally in impact investing, there's been a lot of interest and movement, but at the same time, different use cases. So in some cases, people want comparability. In other cases, they think they might be generating different kinds of value that conventional measurement approaches aren't fully being able to capture or share. And in other cases, you want to be able to innovate and build new portfolios that describe value creation in a quite transformative way. There's a lot of hype around systems change, which we know a lot about at the Skoll Centre. And so how do you think about this intersection between new forms of accounting and the role of tools like this? So I would just say that this is what's exciting for me, in that sometimes people think about this as a very simple concept of let's assign a monetary value to social impact. I think it's much more interesting to think about the different use cases and how they play out across sectors. Because even when we presented this week, we could see quite interesting differences between how corporates versus impact investors are.
Okay, so I mean,
Can I reflect on that one thing? I think it's a tool, and a tool can be used well or badly. So the key question behind is like, what question do you want to answer? That's a key question. The why. You want to make sure you are clear about using the tool, because if you just measure for measuring, I mean, I see all the time doing that. It's not going to work. It's going nowhere. So it's about like you can think about the valuation of the company, the financial valuation of the company, and how impact can influence on the valuation of the company. You can think about the valuation of the solution cost or mitigation cost of climate change, of water scarcity. You can think about the damage cost on health of emission or biodiversity loss. So you have different concepts of valuation that serve different questions, different applications. So first, it's about knowing what you want to get from the tool, and then use the tool appropriately with the right valuation technique behind. And all the cases that you mentioned are all relevant. We see that it's used for risk management, for awareness raising, for transfer of knowledge, for reporting, for access to market, access to capital, business strategy, decision making. Like you have a lot of use case, but it's really about having clarity first on what you want to do and use the valuation appropriately. Otherwise, it might also be used badly for greenwashing. It's not because you do impact valuation that you will be, avoiding all the risks. You can do it badly and use it for, greenwashing.
so I have two questions that come out of this, right?
Yeah.
So one is, clearly it's the various ways of doing impact monetization that are being used differently in many different contexts. And I think in some contexts, like some of the corporate contexts you've worked in, there's a comfort with the monetization side and the learning is on the impact side. And in other contexts, including some of the ones that you've worked in, there's a comfort with the impact side and the learning or the challenge to overcome is like, are we okay with monetization or what does it mean to do that? So I'd like to ask each of you to talk a little bit about how have you helped organizations and the leaders you've worked with shift to adopt an impact thinking mindset? Again, thinking, how do you get them to think about impact as something that can be monetized, and how do you, likewise, with the folks that you're working with, get them to shift to being comfortable with monetization as a way of looking at impact?
Good question. But start reading the book. I think it will give you a lot of answers now. But at the end, it's not about the end results of like measuring. As I said, it's a journey. So most of the clients we have them for a very long time. It's never a one-off study. So and it's not about getting the absolute number of like 5 million or 5 billion. Like we don't really care about this final number. It's really about the process of engaging different stakeholders within the company, outside the company, trying to build common understanding of impact, but also valuation. Valuation brings this question of prioritization, and the valuation can mean different things for different people. So all the process of engaging colleagues, different functions of the company, from the finance to the HR to the operation and the marketing, etc., all bring that together to change the mindset of the company, ultimately change the business strategy and the way we do business and reintegrate business in the society. So for me, it's really been a tool, not so much for the end results of putting a number on something. It's really about the process engagement that will change thinking. And that's why I wrote this book, because I was, after 10 years or 15 years working in that field, I was becoming a bit tired of consulting, of the corporate bullshit, if I can say. And I was like, guys, it's about common sense, really. It's about value. What do we want for the world? So I take the concept of impact valuation, which is quite complex, and might be costly as well, costly. And I bring that back to some concepts and principles that can be applied by anybody in their personal life, in their job, without having to pay super expensive studies. So that was the objective. So I brought back this process of thinking into the book to make it accessible to a wider number of people. That's really what is valuable here. I don't know about you.
Yeah. So I would add a couple of things, and one to another way of framing some of the things you said is, in some ways, using the language that people are familiar with to open up a different kind of conversation instead of questions. But sometimes it can be hard to ask pointed questions around how you're creating positive social impact, or what if you're creating negative social impact. But if you use this tool that, at least at the entry point, feels somewhat familiar for, let's say, a CFO of a large company, or even an impact investment portfolio manager, to say, let's think about the ways in which you're applying the tools the language to think about the ways you say you're creating value or you would like to create value. Let's unpack that a little bit. Often it does raise a set of follow-on questions around why'd you pick this number or not this number? Why are we making this assumption? Or what kind of evidence would back this up? And it does raise, I think, a number of interesting implications. One is you get more transparency simply by going through that process. So I agree with you that process stuff really matters. But for me, one of the goals and challenges we have to deal with in impact measurement is we just don't have enough transparency. It is often a bit of a black box, or we have some transparency in some parts of it, of the processes, and not in others. And so for me, one very direct benefit of monetization is it forces you to unpack some of those assumptions in the language of finance, and you would almost demand a degree of rigor and precision in finance that you should. So I think that's an advantage. I think the other piece is that the comparability aspect is not so much around reporting as in like, did you create more impact than someone else? I think a better question is, can you create the kind of impact you said you were going to create? And can you get more of it based on what you now know? And that's a management question. And so this idea of moving from a, let's call it narrow compliance reporting frame that a lot of organizations do when they do annual reporting, to look at what value they created, I think the unintended, almost positive effect will be they have to look forward at how they might manage for more impact. So for example, if your findings show, and some of the results in the book and the examples we talked about this week are, some companies or investments were delivering less positive impact in the ways that they had claimed to be, or more negative impact than was immediately obvious. Well, what do you do about that? One, you can't ignore it because it's now there. Second, you have to think about this in the context of how are you going to manage it going forward. And third, you have to look at your entire process to say, did we get something wrong? And I think for an investor, that's fantastic learning because that's really what you want to be able to do, is use impact data to inform better decisions going forward and close the feedback loop. But if you're just making investment decisions on the basis of how much money did this organization make, how much risk is contained within my portfolio and how do I minimize that, and then you look at impact at the end of the year, then you're actually not necessarily managing for impact. You're managing for financial return and risk and hoping you get more impact. So I think one of the benefits of this is you're forced to almost bring impact into the equation more dynamically, and you can't ignore it once you know it. And I think people struggle with that, and that becomes a behavioral issue rather than a technical issue.
Okay, and that speaks to the world that
Yes.
I operate in, right, which is the behavioral side of measurement and a lot of other seemingly technical subjects. But just on this measurement piece, so, you know, there's still value, right, in the first step of sort of showing what the level is, right? But you both have experience getting from that to how do you change behavior. And so maybe Sam, I'll ask you for an example of this. Like, how have you helped a firm go from the compliance side to the how do we use that? How do we use this for management purposes, for improvement purposes?
Yeah, that's a good, good question. I mean, systematically, when we do this kind of analysis, we realize that we are biased as human. And so the best tool you can use to change people and change decision is by showing a different version of the reality with impact assessment or impact valuation that clash with the reality of what people think. Typically, working with a Summa Equity or Astana or another VC fund, systematically with any kind of investor, we realize that part of the portfolio, there are always some companies that have a net negative impact. And they're supposed to be investing for impact. They should know what they're doing. They are investor professional, impact professional that should invest for impact. So normally all the portfolio should be performing, okay, it's more or less good, but should not have a negative impact. But actually there is kind of another side or bias of thinking where people don't, if they don't measure, they might think there is a positive impact, whereas there is a negative one. Similarly for Natura, I mentioned Natura before, it's a direct sales company. So they sell directly through 2 million women in Latin America for the brand of Natura. And their thinking was that we're raising women out of poverty, 2 million women. When we did the valuation, we realized that 70% of the women didn't have a living wage and were struggling to make the end of the month. And actually investing all this time for very little money actually had a negative impact on those women. So we took 2 years to really convince the management of the company, the CEO, to say, guys, look at that. It's like not what you're saying, you're claiming on the roof everywhere. It's actually a different reality. We need to address it. And if you invest in those women, they sell more, then the business will be also more profitable. So how can we, rebalance things? And so for me, this clash between what people think and what is the reality is very much a great tool to actually push people to think differently. And sometimes it's hard, as I said, we were almost fired a couple of times. They wanted to come back to PwC, and then we shift for the project from there. And then it was like a mess. People were attacking us. They attacked data, they attacked methodology, they recalculated everything. They asked for verification, expertise, and at the end, they just kind of, okay, actually, that makes sense. We need to kind of rebalance the strategy and refocus on it. So that's a great tool to do that.
And I think for me, so the example I'll go back to when I was working at Social Capital Partners, we tested this approach on a variety of very different social enterprises. And the idea was that for certain kinds of outcomes, a social enterprise model is delivering value in different ways. And we can use this language of monetization to express that, particularly around social return on investment. I think and so for each of the companies, they actually end up getting different kind of value from this process. Some of them could go to additional funders or investors and say, our stories that really resonate with you today actually only capture part of the value they were creating. Here's another way to describe what we're actually doing. Other value that they got would be to say, who comes next in that kind of capital chain as you try and scale your social enterprise to something that looks much more like an integrated strategy, for example, around influence and policy. So in a way, you're using a social enterprise and an SROI approach to make the case that it matters in a scalable way for government. Either because the costs that are currently being incurred are really high but are just invisible, or the benefits could be outsized and you can model that over time. And you've proven that in some limited way through the business model. I think one frustration sometimes with this, the numbers part is that people look at the numbers in a singular way. When we try, I think in our work to put a lot of context behind that and be transparent around our assumptions. So I remember for me, that was a big frustration because we had this incredibly diverse portfolio, a bike courier company helping young people who never had their first job to get their first job and move into stable employment and housing. It's very different from a company that is trying to rebuild neighborhoods owned by indigenous people in Winnipeg. Right? So you have completely different interventions, but if you have a SROI or monetization kind of number or ratio, and someone says, well, that number seems to be higher than this number, but they're looking to do very different things. This model may never scale, but it actually has a ton of value and may only serve 20 or 25 young people, but that makes a big difference in the model there around social value. However, this other model should essentially transition into, let's say, public policy intervention and be applied at a systematic level. And really what we're trying to do is provide the evidence and data for that. And so I think one challenge when organizations use this for their own use cases, the rest of us will try and derive some conclusions from that around generalizability. Is it just best to take one set of interventions? Sometimes. Sometimes it's pretty obvious what you're choosing between. In other cases, you will need to be quite careful about saying, what is the number actually telling us and what context is appropriate to be able to then move it to a, let's say, different level of scale. And I think, at least again, from the SROI version, that seems like some of that nuance didn't always play out in reality. We see some of that within social impact ones, and outcome payments. There's a lot of interest and attention around monetizing because you can come up with a rate card and you can think about savings and all of that. But the reality is, if you do it in one place, can it scale up in another? That's a very different question than what is the best form of monetization for a specific type of social issue area? Is it even desirable? And I think just being clear about when we use monetization and in what use cases, I think not just can we do it, but under what cases are we going to do it in order to inform the next decision? That's something we need to spend more time on. Because I think it does play out in, for example, the corporate world differently than it does in the social enterprise and impact investing.
But I think so.
I just want to jump in for one thing, because I want to call out two really important things that even said. So one is conversation, right? So where you started with your example with Natura was you use the tool to engage them in a conversation to get them thinking. And of course there's challenge and pushback, but that sounds like a super important part, right? So the conversation and the context in which that conversation is happening, in which the measurement is being done, right? And both of those are, I think, what you're saying are super important parts of what does it take to do this well.
Yeah, nobody takes a decision only on this number. So you need to consider the first use case, why you're doing that, And then this number, I never seen, well, yes, I've seen, but very few times, like less than 1% of the case where an investor or business would just solely take a decision not to invest, not to pursue a project solely based on this information on impact valuation. So I think that that's very true what you're saying, and it's about the context, understanding like what are the decision drivers. There are always like 4 or 5. There's a context of stakeholders, and there's many reasons why you will still invest in a project that is low performance. Because you can engage maybe with them, you can help them scale up by 10 times the impact in 10 years. Like there's many reasons for that, or because it brings all the business value or reputation or many things. So I think that's the same. People think that we reduce all the complexity to one number. But actually, it's not true. The process, you said, is the part that's important. The process where you ask the right question, you talk to the right people, you bring the context into the decision-making process. That's what it is about. The final number, again, is not that important.
I do think this reflects almost like a maturity around some of these conversations, because in some ways we demand more transparency and we demand more of that kind of process and then the decision implications. And I would say, I remember even, a while ago, this wasn't necessarily the case that people thought the numbers would give you the answer, as opposed to the numbers inform the set of decisions that you're looking for. But I think we're all a bit smarter about that now because of the maturity of some of these practices and the fact that there is more transparency and more use cases.
So, alongside, you're right, like this field in a way is much more mature now. And there's been sort of a parallel development that I want to bring into the conversation, which is around what many people in the old fire station here locally in Oxford is sort of one of the key users of this term. Many people are calling meaningful measurement. And we have a joint project with the old fire station. Jonas is here with us, who's doing that research to understand what does meaningful measurement look like on the ground, and what is the role of storytelling in impact measurement and in creating meaningful measures of impact. So how does that approach sit alongside impact monetization? How can they inform one another? Are you seeing people doing both kinds of measurement? And what are the sort of trade-offs associated with each one?
Yeah, for me, it's really complementary. As I said before, impact valuation is just one tool. We can bring stakeholders' perspective stories into the impact pathway that goes from activities, output, outcome, impact. And impact is monetized at this stage. So we can bring at the level of the activity, the output, for example, some stories from the people, from what they feel, what they prioritize in terms of activity, what they receive from what they receive, and an outcome actually. And that can fit into the same kind of tool of monetization. We're not obligated to monetize it. Maybe, or depending on the purpose of the activity, we just want to listen to their preference, make sure that the project serve their preference, right? But monetization can, depending on the case, can bring another lens of prioritization on things that you don't necessarily see or that you can ask to people. For example, we had a lot of projects where in Nordic countries where they have the employment of people that are immigrants or disadvantaged people, and all the NGO we were working with were focused on the income part and the satisfaction of the integration, the feeling of belonging of the people. And actually, when we did the valuation, we realized that a big part of the value was actually the avoided social benefit payment from the state and local authorities and the additional tax that was brought and all the other like healthcare costs. That was a huge benefit that was even bigger in absolute terms compared to the income. So we suddenly realized that actually the big stakeholders we a bit forgot from the project was the state and local authorities and they could become partners to the project, supporters. They can bring a subvention, or they can provide in-kind contribution space to work out and integrate better this society. So I think it's very complementary to come back to the question. It can be embedded, but you cannot measure everything just asking people. It's just one part of the story. So as impact valuation is just one tool that can bring one lens, but it's not always useful. So I see that as very complementary. I don't see, like many people think it's an opposite and we have one or the other approach, but for me, it's part of the same story, part of the same pathways.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think because we have such different audiences and users of impact measurement for different decisions, we do need a combination often. When we see that sometimes people are more familiar with and almost demand the language of numbers, we can respond with some different tools and perspectives. And monetization, as Sam said, is just one of those approaches. Storytelling is powerful. We know that. And then we get questions around, is this one story or are there multiple stories? And this is where some of the tools can be used in a complementary fashion, because you could say, here's how we move from one case to a more generalizable story, if that's even true. But also, when we think about more generalizable numbers around assigning valuation, you still need to zoom in on, well, what does the reality of change look like that we're trying to get at? And so I think that the challenge is this classic, Sam was saying sometimes we're artificially forced to choose. But it's partly because of training, it's partly because of the organizations, it's partly because of the ways in which we prioritize different kinds of value. I think part of what impact thinking is almost demands a comfort with the two sides of your brain, like to use qualitative and quantitative data, to be able to look back and look forward, to be able to think about your internal stakeholders and your external stakeholders. And that's not something that often singular methods will provide. They often give you one frame of reference. Let's look back for internal stakeholders, assign a certain kind of value to them. Well, what we're trying to do, I think, with this combination of the toolkit is to say, how do storytelling and valuation methods combine and complement each other, but the decisions within an organization might demand more of one or the other at any particular time. And organizations have to be open to that. And I think as opposed to saying, just give us the annual report and tell us how many people lives you affected, or something that looks very macro, but actually doesn't tell you around what you do next.
I'm going to ask for one more set of examples before we go to our last question, which is, so you've just described, I think, really nicely what would be an effective approach to using a complementary set of tools. Where are you seeing that? Who's doing that well?
Not enough organization.
We need to think about this. Yeah.
Go.
I would say that certainly in my world now, which is much more around impact investors, and particularly those that are either asset owner level or asset manager level, there are a number of different groups that are trying to combine these different methodologies and really bring impact thinking into it. So not as opposed to saying we'll pick some metrics, we'll pick a theory change, or we'll pick a kind of reporting framework, trying to combine all of those in maybe some different ways. So one of the groups I've worked with recently is it's a venture capital fund that is trying to address this big challenging issue of how do you eradicate modern slavery in supply chains through tech solutions. I mean, it's a pretty big issue, and impact investing has maybe a really small, narrow contribution. But interestingly, through the fund itself, they had bigger questions around, can impact investing be a tool for systemic change? In order to answer that, you have to ask questions that are kind of big picture questions that are answered through, let's say, research. You have to ask questions around systems dynamics. You have to ask questions around the growth of your portfolio and the growth of the market. So in that case, we've been able to combine, I would say, multiple types of forms of data. So you've got some quantitative measures that are organizational. You've got some quantitative measures that are market-facing, so the demand for these services. You've got qualitative aspects around, what does worker feedback look like in a qualitative sense that you can actually bring to light, so that investors that say they care about ESG actually are able to understand how worker voices get captured within ESG scores. Now, there's still a long distance between those things, but for me, this is what I think that the kind of new wave of impact measurement looks like, as opposed to singular methods and tools. How do we think about creative combinations? And when you get into it, you're asking, what are the incentives to do that? I think one of the incentives are transparency. We all are a little skeptical, or at least certainly I'm skeptical, whenever I see anyone saying something like, we impacted 1,000 lives, or we created this kind of positive impact. I'm like, tell me more. And what are the 3 or 4 data points beyond that? So I think transparency and skepticism is a big driver. The other, for better or worse, is regulation. We know that a lot of the voluntary initiatives that have a lot of self-disclosed data aren't getting to that level of quality, transparency, and consistency that we would require to say, yeah, I believe you, and I believe you over time. And so this is where some of these methods I think are interesting, but this is, around monetization and transparency. But for me, it's impact thinking, at least one of the elements of it is that you have a critical lens anytime you see non-financial information or non-financial claims. And then you have the toolkit to be able to ask questions of the numbers and of the narrative, and then to be able to try and get a sense of, well, what kind of information is good enough to be able to make judgments around what happens next. Because I think one of the shifts around this is to move from a more static orientation to looking at data and saying, yeah, this was good enough impact to a, well, what is good enough impact? Who decided that? What's the threshold? What's the kind of unit of success? And so this is the next wave, I think, when we move from monetization to transparency to now thinking about how much impact is enough for companies that say that they're doing something good for the world. And I don't think we've been able to get there because up to now we are focused much more on standards and tools and frameworks. Now we're asking like, what is good enough? How much impact should you be creating? How much negative impact is acceptable? And when you have a tool like impact valuation that shows if there's way more impact, negative impact than you've publicly accounted for, you get a very different response. You know, if you did that rather than, I would say sometimes the newspaper headlines obviously do make a difference, but they can be buried, particularly in the age of AI. You know, so it's finding these creative ways to say, how do we truly reflect value in all of this? You know, it's a long
Okay,
answer.
no, that's great, and I
I
heard a bit about conversation in there, right? Using the tool as a way to start a conversation, to ask questions.
Yeah.
To learn. and-
Different questions though, because I think now we have different data and we can ask different questions than we did before. And some of this was not previously visible. And I would say some of Sam's work is, you know, you've made some of the sources and proxies and valuation materials public. So that any company that makes a claim, you can still look at a public database and say, well, let's see if it matches up with the claim that you've said. And I think that's holding companies and investors to account in different ways than we used to be able to.
Yeah, we are about to make it, all the methodologies, all the data set public within a couple of months. We will be supported by Natura, by impact investors in Europe and US. So a lot of, there is a need for public information, like we cannot keep that as a black box. We need the transparency so that people can use the tool and judge the communication of companies. You were asking like who is doing it? I think this was also the question. I think just an analogy is like, if you have an iceberg and you have the tip of the iceberg, that's a company like Natura, Suma Equity, Standard that I was mentioning. You have a lot of companies that are using, a lot more companies that are using the concept just internally now. There is a huge part of the companies that are yet to, like are using the concept, but they don't talk about it, they use it as a competitive advantage. And then you have the ocean to conquer still. And I think that's a role of this book, of the discussion today, of you acquiring this impact thinking skill to really make a change at the bigger scale later. So like we still have the world to conquer in the ocean.
Okay, okay. Well, with that, let's turn it over to you all here in the room, and also those of you joining online for questions.
Yeah. Hi, thank you all so much for being here. This is, looking at the names on this talk, on this panel, it was unbelievable. It was like, oh my God, I don't know if there's anyone else I'd want to listen to for an hour about this. So I'm really, really grateful you're all here. Quick question around ethical constraints of monetization, the ethical constraints around quantifying things that some would say are inherently unquantifiable things. Quantification is necessary for monetization in some ways. And so curious, like how you price the benefit to an outcomes payer of a human life or a child who is not exposed to human trafficking. And then, of course, that's a huge question. So then the question, the more meta question of, okay, that's obviously hard. So what do we do about that in the movement? And how do we address that skepticism? And how do we address the complexity of that question in order to continue doing the work?
I think I saw much more on this ethical question like 10 years ago. You still have, I think, a guy in the UK named George Monbiot, writing for the Guardian, that is quite a critic of this approach. But at the end of the day, for me, it's even if we don't put a value on things, we will still have preference. We still, gonna buy a brand versus another. We're still gonna, I don't know, prefer taking risk and climbing a mountain and still getting injured because we still in our behavior, we're still gonna have preferences and put value on things like implicitly. So for me, it's just about bringing those choices that we make every day visible, putting a value on it. And as soon as we are transparent about how we do that and what's the purpose of that, I think there is no resistance when I talk to the business, because yes, I had the question like, how come you can put a value on the life of people, then you're gonna trade the people, and then you're gonna make slavery, and I'm just like, no, we have to define the value and the price too. That's another critics that happen a lot, like how do we differentiate between two? We talk about monetization, I think it's not the right one, apparently. Should have said that at the beginning. Maybe you talk about valuation rather than monetization, because monetization comes from money, which is the medium of exchange, which is part of a market, and we're not putting a value on things to make it a market and start selling biodiversity and selling life. It's not a market, it's about putting priorities on things. It can be also not a monetary like valuation, it can be a prioritization with plus and minus, and that is already useful. So that's the way we thought about it in the past 10, 15 years, and we overcome the barriers of many people and critics saying that it's not ethical to value life and biodiversity. I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, I mean, I have mixed feelings about this because I feel like every 5 years when I counter this or go deeper on it, I come out in a different place. But I think on one hand, as Sam was saying, we already do this. As a society, we rank things, we value things, decisions are made on the basis of quality of life and things like that someone has assigned a number to someone. I think one benefit from this is, can we do that better to incorporate the range of different perspectives that sometimes are excluded, that other methodologies probably haven't done in as expansive or maybe as transparent a way. So I think for me, the new wave of interest in this is to be able to advance that. I still think maybe not in a corporate side, we can have a whole discussion about that, whether the corporate ethical concerns, where they show up and whether it's just on the regulatory side or kind of self-motivated. Let's say in my worlds, which are impact-oriented organizations of various kinds, everything from the public sector to social sector impact investing, those concerns exist everywhere all the time and come up regularly. And I think many of them are credible and legitimate, and we need to be thoughtful around not overextending the intended uses and the appropriate uses of these methodologies. Essentially, it's just a tool. And like any other tool, if you use it beyond what it's capable of or intentionally misuse it, of which we may see more examples around, frankly, as this gets more popular, then I think we need the ability to be able to critique it, the ability to have repercussions for it, and I think to also have a healthy skepticism anytime we see this tool being employed in the real world. And I would say in my world, this is going to continue to be a challenge, and probably will be more of a challenge now that I'm seeing more examples. I think the interesting part will be when different actors intersect with each other, like government and private actor, private capital, etc. Do they all agree around the value and use of this way of thinking and working? Because even within government and outcomes contracting, you've seen some challenges and shifts over time. I think as it's being applied to nonprofits and social purpose organizations, you do see a challenge around, hey, we're doing really important work. Maybe it can be captured within some kind of monetary frame or valuation frame, but should you, and is it the best thing to get us to the next level of growth or engagement or improvement? And sometimes the answer is no, and that's okay.
Just pull out two things from this. So one is, again, what's the use case? Sort of, it's a tool towards what are we putting in? And then from what you said, the question of transparency, like even if we've got that down, how can we be as transparent as possible about how we got to that valuation or that monetization?
Hi, thank you so much. So I've got an easy question or a hard question, I think, at the point. So the first one is, how does this relate to integrated reporting? Seems to me it might be quite an easy bit. And the second one is a bit more existential. You've presented businesses as if they're all the same, private sector businesses, and have the same attitudes. And we know from research that sometimes business owners will say, how dare you suggest to me that I should put a monetary value on my social responsibility, on my ethics, and take quite deep offence to that suggestion. And even CEOs, probably senior people in organisations, sometimes say, don't come to me with a business case, we're doing it because it's the right thing. So it's not always the case that business people have this compliance with a monetary or a standard valuation approach. So how then do you play? So I'll leave you to pick what you like.
Good questions. You want to answer the first one, integrated reporting? It's your question. Well, we'll answer the second one too.
Yes.
Yeah.
The person's the first question. No, integrated reporting, I think this is reporting trends have always come very late for me in the game of like impact measurement, sustainability strategy. So they kind of like 10 years behind whatever like the best practice are in terms of impact thinking. So integrated reporting is a nice tool. It's been existing since many years, but the requirements and the kind of indicators you put inside are not necessarily, I mean, they're not impact valuation. Impact valuation is used by more advanced minded businesses and investors to derive from it a competitive advantage, and you look at a new view of the world. And it's not yet getting to integrated reporting. So we have this disconnect between, you know, the GSI reporting, the CDP reporting, the GRI. The indicators are so basic, and they're not necessarily useful and might influence badly the rating. We were discussing on the way here about that. And we have impact valuation, which is more advanced. So hopefully it will catch up. Like we're talking about policy, that's another discussion we're having. But I think we're still 10 years before it can enter the standard of reporting this well.
Yeah, but just for others that are less familiar, the integrated reporting is the idea of having financials and financial P&L to be alongside this natural social capital reporting in a way that shows integrated value, and that provides a more hopefully accurate or at least aligned assessment of when a company says it's doing certain things or prioritizing certain things. You can see that alongside the classic numbers that they would report on. Yeah, and I think on the kind of, which you will answer to, is the hard question, you know, it's an interesting one because in some ways everybody loves more transparency or says they love transparency, but when you actually come down to it, there's this visual that we also saw in the class is like, you know, who wants change? You know, everyone raises their hands and who wants to change, you know? So we live in this era right now where we are talking about these issues around transparency and ethics and accountability and AI. At the same time, the consequences of that are not evenly distributed because, you know, who's going to benefit and who's going to lose, I think are still up in the air. So for me, there are still organizations that say it's totally appropriate to say this is just the right thing to do, and by bringing this approach, we might dampen the kind of motivation or value or even the reason why we are trying to do this, because it's just a part of who we are. I would say the question back to those companies and others would be, how can you get more of it? And sometimes that's a much harder question to answer, because what if you're doing something well, but as part of, let's call it your corporate responsibility or even just your mission orientation, you're creating a fraction of the value that you otherwise could without making some of this visible. And we do see companies like B Corps, when they move from an orientation of I'm a mission-oriented company to then beginning to think about the B Corp label and all of the kind of reporting and transparency and accountability. Again, this is not in a generalizable way, but there are some examples that say, yeah, I need to do more of this than I otherwise would. Or there are certain things that I didn't prioritize and now I will. So for me, that's a much better question to ask is, even if you don't believe that you should monetize everything, are you getting the most social or environmental impact from the existing work that you're doing? And where can you get more of it? And how do you make the case for it? And if the company says, well, we're just going to do that anyway, that's amazing. The reality is often we're living in this era of how do we cut or how do we constrain? And if companies don't want to lose that mission orientation that's particularly important to them, it can be important to make the benefits visible alongside not just the costs. And this is where I think this type of approach can be valuable, because it shows you things in the same kind of line item, benefits and costs. And sometimes we don't place equal priority to those. We just look at these as a cost center rather than the real benefits that we create. That would be my answer, but Sam, I don't know if you've got another one.
Not necessarily a better one, but maybe a complementary one where I think like very simply for me, when you see resistance and those different best perception of people inside companies, for me, it's just about knocking at the open doors, like the one that are already open, that don't try to convince a person that is that do not agree with you. So it's also about that. We see very little resistance. I mean, all the work we do is people that are convinced, that are sponsor of the idea internally, that are moving forward. And when we see resistance, I get criticized by my colleague very often saying, hey, they're wrong, we need to convince them. And I'm just like, seriously, I don't care. I need to invest time on people that can build further, that can elevate the topic, can change the company. I don't want to convince someone who doesn't want to be convinced. So I'm just going to skip it at the desperation of some of my colleagues.
I hear you, and I'll take from your answer that it's measurement as a tool for learning, right? And if there's other vehicles for learning, no problem. But if this can be a useful tool, how about we introduce that?
Yeah, and if you think it matters to you, and there are other ways to describe the value you're creating, use those. This is, again, one of those things, and particularly because it's, we all, many of us, understand the language of finance, and it seems to still have power, the language of numbers.
Yeah.
And so if we want to challenge that, with storytelling, better storytelling, we should certainly do that. But I think if the system as is values certain things over other things, and so let's at least infiltrate it with more of this kind of thinking. So for me, that's the power of, some of the concepts of this.
Okay, on that note, I'm gonna draw this part of the discussion to a close. It's 4:30. Thank you all so much for joining us here in person and online. Thank you, Karim and Sam, for this really engaging conversation. And thank you to Kellogg for hosting us in this seminar here today. Those of you who are here, we're gonna have a reception. Please join us outside in the gardens. This is the last seminar of the year, so celebrate with us a year of insights for action, and look forward to the fall. We will be back again in Michaelmas term with another set of. Thank you.